Hello everyone, and welcome back to Lecture 2. In Lecture 1 we explored some of the issues affecting professional practice, architectural practice in South Africa. And in Lecture 2 what I want to do is just go see to what extent is this duplicated in other countries. Now we see in a lot of the social media that in South Africa it's the small fee pool, which to some extent is true. Slow GDP growth, which of course is also true, inefficiencies, shifting of work due to be, all of these things are valid. But here's the thing, when you go check in other markets where these are not necessarily part and parcel of daily living, like France, the UK, New Zealand, markets with vastly different political landscapes, the story is the same. So we're going to look at some data from 2025 and 2026. And essentially, I think the message that emerges for me anyway is that the architectural profession is facing systemic liquidation globally. So we really do need to remove the noise. And what the data would suggest is that essentially the business model of architecture is no longer structurally viable. Turning to France, very recently, where there's no BE policy, there's really high public spending, but since 2025, the sector has seen between 2 and 5 rounds of layoffs every single month. In the shock metric, so the first half of 2025 alone, 15 court-ordered liquidations hit firms that have in fact been in existence for 30 to 40 years. So this captures a very particular set of data. We don't know how many just voluntarily closed shop. Essentially, the takeaway there is if the 40-year-old French firms are closing because they lack the cash flow to withstand late payments, and particularly in France, a housing slump, then resilience isn't the issue. The model is. In Indian practice, an architect is expected to do all those complex regulations, balance cost, climate constructability and authorities, take responsibility long after the building is occupied. And why I mention India is not because of the similarity to South Africa, but because even where architectural responsibility is expansive, remuneration is collapsing. There's a disconnect between how much more an architect is expected to do for less income. A fact from practice in India, architectural fees in India have steadily reduced over the years. While on the other hand, expectations, liabilities and accountabilities have increased. And this comes from a posting on LinkedIn from Suradaka right this year, completely unsolicited. And I know this is kind of episodic and it's not necessarily a result of a broad survey, but I thought it interesting that this person was compelled to in fact identify issues which we have also been identifying over the past few weeks and months. In the UK, where we do have a big set of data, the UK architects' average annual salaries are now £13,000 lower than chartered surveyors. That kind of asks a particular question about then how are these chartered surveyors doing it, and we'll explore that as we go down the line. But again, UK, massive increase in regulatory liability and administrative hurdles, no increase in fees. So when you provide more value across any of those task-related requirements for the same or less money, you're not a professional. You are a price taker in a commodity market. United States, 3-year slump. Architecture billings in the US has spent 35 of the last 38 months in contraction, despite interest rates stabilizing. Firm profitability remains the #1 concern for 2026 amongst practitioners. So what's alarming here is this is before Trump. This is during the Biden administration. This is on the back of the Infrastructure Act. And architects still could not find a healthy margin. I've mentioned the Design Performance Review, and particularly the 2025 global census they did, of over 450 professionals in 64 countries. So that's quite a big sweep. 20%, 1 in 5, are actively seeking to leave the industry in the next 5 years. And the reason? Culture of exploitation. 66% of respondents work unpaid overtime to keep projects viable. So there's two things happening. There's an exploitation on behalf of the client, but there's an internal exploitation on behalf of the leadership of that practice towards their workers. So 1 in 5 leaves you with a pretty devastated profession at the end of the day. What's the common thread? Ultimately, all fighting for a small fee pool, not necessarily because of who's in power, but because the role of the architect has been downgraded from lead consultant to service vendor across the planet. We can say quite safely, if the problem were simply fees, it could be solved with advocacy. But what these cases are showing is something deeper, a redefinition of professional value itself. In the next lecture, I'm going to describe the system, call it the spiderweb, but sticky, that produces this outcome, regardless of geography. So essentially, we do have a kind of a self-evident problem. I'm not going to try and solve that problem today, but what I do want to say is this. If we continue to compete on price, we will continue to liquidate. If we continue to accept more liability for less fee, we will continue to lose 20% of our talent every 5 years. And so perhaps the question that we need to deal with is not how to get more work, or maybe even how to get better fees or higher fees. The question I think that is emerging is, why are we still practicing a 19th century business model in a 2026 economy? We'll have a go at unpacking that in the next lecture.